am 88 years old now. I have spent nearly my entire life in a small, weathered town on the coast of Maine, tucked tightly between the relentless gray Atlantic and the jagged, pine-covered mountains that seem to watch us in silence. In this part of the world, winter is not just a season. It is a test of endurance where the sun barely schemes the horizon before retreating, leaving us in a long, bruised twilight, and summer is a fevered dream of white nights where time feels as though it has simply stopped breathing. When you live as long as I have, you begin to grasp truths that are almost impossible to translate for the young. There is a specific kind of wisdom that only comes after watching the tide go out and come back in 30,000 times. You learn that the world does not owe you ease, that storms are as inevitable as the sunrise, and that the things you think define you at 30 will seem like dust by the time you reach 80. Today, I want to tell you a truth about marriage. A truth that almost no one has the courage to say out loud anymore because it isn't cinematic, it isn't sweet, and it doesn't fit into the neatly packaged stories we consume on our screens. The real reason so many marriages crumble today isn't what you hear from the polished experts on podcasts or read in the endless rows of self-help books. It isn't a lack of communication, a buzzword that gets thrown around until it loses all meaning. It isn't that people magically grow apart like branches in a storm, though people often claim that as a convenient excuse for their own apathy. It isn't even that the love simply vanishes into thin air like fog. Those are just the coughs and fevers. They are symptoms, not the disease itself. The real cause is much simpler and much more uncomfortable to hear. People believe that marriage is a machine designed to manufacture their happiness. Think about that for a moment. Our entire modern culture is a cathedral built to worship this single, fragile idea. We are told to find the soulmate who makes us happy. Find the person who completes you, as if you were born a jagged, half-finished thing. We act as though another flawed, struggling human being is supposed to be the mechanic who repairs our internal brokenness. We look for a partner to be our therapist, our best friend, our financial advisor, our entertainment, and our source of constant validation. This is perhaps the most dangerous myth of our age, and it has laid waste to more homes than money, infidelity, or anger ever could. It is an impossible burden to place on any one person's shoulders. My name is Arthur. I was married to my wife, Sarah, for exactly 60 years. She passed away 2 years ago this spring, and not a day goes by where I don't look toward the kitchen and expect to see her there, stirring a pot of soup or complaining about the draft from the back door. If there is one thing I mastered during 6 decades of waking up next to the same person, it is this: Sarah did not make me happy. I know that sounds like a cold, brutal thing to say about a woman I adored with every fiber of my being. But please, hear me out before you turn away. Sarah made me furious more times than I can count. She made me laugh until my chest ached. She challenged my arrogance and forced me to look at the world through eyes that weren't my own. She gave me 3 daughters who have her stubborn chin and her restless spirit. She complained bitterly every time I tracked salt and mud across the kitchen floor after a long day on the docks. She had a way of looking at me during an argument, a sharp, silent squint, that made me feel like the most difficult man in the entire state of Maine. She did 1,000 things in my life, but my happiness was never her responsibility. It was never her job to carry the weight of my contentment. When you place the burden of your personal joy on the shoulders of another person, you give them a task that no human being is strong enough to perform. Eventually, you will begin to punish them for failing at an impossible mission. That is how the rot starts. 2 people stand at the altar expecting a constant fountain of bliss, and the moment the water runs dry, they assume the relationship is broken. But the marriage isn't the problem. The expectation is the problem. Sarah and I married in 1964. I was 30 years old, a man of the sea, working on a commercial fishing boat. For half the year, I was a ghost, lost somewhere in the cold mist of the North Atlantic. People told her she was a fool to marry a man who was never home, a man who smelled of diesel and fish scales, a man who would leave her to raise children alone for months at a time. She just smiled at them. She wasn't looking for a man to complete her. She was looking for a partner to build a life with. And building a life is not a series of romantic sunsets and candlelit dinners. Building a life is manual labor. It is cold mornings in an unheated house when the furnace gives out at 4 in the morning. It is the crushing weight of bills that pile up while the fishing is lean. It is the terrifying, hollow sound of a child gasping with a fever in the middle of the night. It is a roof that decides to leak during a November gale when the money is too tight to hire a contractor. Marriage is like building a stone wall in a storm. Some days your partner sets a stone crooked. You have two choices. You can tear the whole wall down in a fit of frustration, or you can set your next stone a little differently to compensate so the wall keeps standing. That is love in practice. It isn't a feeling. It's an adjustment. It is the willingness to be the foundation when the other person is crumbling. I was a quiet man, a man of granite and silence. Sarah, on the other hand, could talk for hours. I could spend 3 days on a boat without uttering more than 5 words, and that silence drove her to the brink of madness. In the early years, she read magazines that told her we needed to communicate more. She would sit me down at the small wooden table in our kitchen and say, "Arthur, we have to talk. Really talk." I would sit there feeling as though she were asking me to perform surgery on a jet engine with a spoon. I simply didn't have the words. I was raised in a time when a man's feelings were things you buried deep, like heavy stones at the bottom of the sea. For the first 12 years, she tried to fix me. She tried to turn a silent man into a talkative one. It didn't work. The more she pushed, the more I retreated into the fog. The more she demanded sentences, the quieter I became, locking myself away in a fortress of my own making. She thought our marriage was failing because we didn't speak the same language. But the marriage was fine. Her expectation was the barrier. She thought love had to be heard in poems and declarations. She didn't realize that my language was written in the things I did, in the rhythm of our domestic life. When she was sick, I didn't always ask how she felt. I went into the kitchen and made a pot of chowder because I knew she hadn't eaten. When she was sad, I didn't offer a speech. I went into the yard and fixed that sagging gate she had mentioned months ago, wanting to make her world just a little bit sturdier. When we had a bitter row, I rarely said, "I'm sorry." My pride was a terrible, stubborn thing. But the next morning, her car was warmed up and the snow was cleared from her path before she even woke. That was my dialect. It was the only way I knew how to say, "I am here and I am yours." One morning, after nearly 15 years together, she finally heard me. I had gone down to the wharf before dawn, but I had left a hot thermos of tea on the counter and moved her boots inside because I had felt the humidity in the air and knew the rain was coming. She told me years later that she sat at the table that morning and it finally clicked. She realized I had been talking to her every single day for 15 years. She just hadn't been listening to the right frequency. She saw the care in the tea and the protection in the boots. From that day on, she stopped trying to change the weather of my soul, and I stopped feeling like I was a constant disappointment. Suddenly, the air in our home became easier to breathe, and we settled into a partnership that didn't need constant verbal affirmation to be real. There is another truth I must tell you, and this one is the hardest to swallow. In a marriage, you will feel lonely. Not just once in a while, but deeply, profoundly lonely. There will be nights when you feel more isolated lying next to your partner than you ever did when you were single. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of being human. Marriage does not fuse two souls into one person. You remain two distinct lives, two separate histories. Sometimes those lives intertwine beautifully, like two vines on a trellis, supporting each other toward the sun. Other times, they run parallel, like two boats moving through the same dark fjord, separated by a mile of cold water. People leave their marriages because of that distance. They think, if I feel lonely, I must be with the wrong person. So they jump ship. They find someone new, and for 6 months, the soulmate myth feels real again. But infatuation is just a chemical trick, a biological bribe to keep the species going. When the high wears off, the loneliness returns, because the problem was never the other person. The loneliness is part of the human condition, and no husband or wife is a cure for it. They are only a witness to it. You have to learn to be whole by yourself before you can ever be a true partner to someone else. Sarah died of cancer after a short, brutal battle. From the first pain to the end, it was only 9 months. Those 9 months were the most holy time of my life. The house became quiet, our world shrinking down to the size of her hospital bed in the living room. During those final weeks, she said more words of love than she had in the previous 50 years combined. She told me she was proud of the life we built, even the messy, difficult, unromantic parts. She told me I was the only person who truly knew her, and that was enough to make the fear go away. She told me she wished we had spent more time just sitting and talking, but I just smiled at her, held her thin hand, and said, "Sarah, I've always known. I didn't need the words. The light in the window when I came home from the sea told me. The way she tucked an extra pair of dry socks into my bag in the winter told me she cared. She had been saying, 'I love you,' for 60 years. She just said it in the language of chores and shared silence. She passed away on a Tuesday morning while I was holding her hand. Her last words weren't a grand declaration of romance or a plea for mercy. She looked at me, her voice a mere whisper, and asked, 'Arthur, have you eaten today?' That was her 'I love you.' It was her final act of care, proving that even as she was leaving, her primary concern was that I was fed, that I was looked after. So to those of you listening, especially those of you navigating the middle years of a long walk together, we have lived long enough to know that life doesn't get easier, but it does get clearer. Time acts as a solvent, washing away the trivial arguments and the petty grievances until only the bedrock remains. If you have been married for decades, or if you have stood where I am standing and said goodbye to the person who knew your silences, please speak up. Write in the comments. Tell us your story. Share a piece of your own wall of stone. Perhaps the younger generation can learn that love isn't a feeling you find. It's an environment you survive and build together. Don't waste your precious time trying to craft a public image of perfection. Don't sacrifice your connection on the altar of your own ego. Because in the end, life isn't about the perfect moments or the highlight reel. It's about the person you choose to stand with when the road is silent, difficult, and lonely. I am an old man, and I know that my own horizon is drawing near. I have no regrets about the life I lived, but I carry a deep and abiding hope for you. I hope you find someone who is willing to build with you, someone who understands that the wall is more important than the pride. I hope you find the grace to listen to the language of the other person, even when it isn't spoken in the words you expect. Thank you for listening to an old man's memories, for letting me unburden this heart one more time. It means more to me than I can say. Please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with your own truth. It helps others find this place. And share this with someone who is struggling to find the stones for their own wall today. Be well, and cherish the one who stands beside you.